change it, rearrange it, gotta move on now. You gotta move when the timing is hot. You gotta give it whatever you got. You gotta look down the road, lighten the load, slip out before you get caught. You gotta give up the race, get to your place before you find what you're thinking is not. Oh yeah, yeah, shake it baby, shake it baby, shake it baby now. Wake it baby, take it baby before you forget how. Time's wasted, life's for tasting, shake it baby now. Oh yeah.
1960, mid-January. You can't win 'em all. Perry took a gulp of beer and looked at her friend with a wry roll of her eyes. I was never totally sold on Leo in the first place. I mean, he's nice enough, but not my kind of person, you know? On the other hand, what do I know? People get attracted to the strangest strangers, don't they? And she sent another wry look to Tom, her husband, as she blew him a kiss. Stranger than strange, commented Tom. They had been married for 3.5 years, and were a comfortable duo, friends and lovers, and both of them involved in theater that liked to push people's thinking just a little bit. Their disagreements flared like flash fires here and there, but their sense of fun and energy seemed to make them inseparable. I thought he was okay. A pretty reliable guy, he said. Ilona pushed her chair back and walked across the tiny kitchenette. She looked at the theater playbills pinned up on the walls, and out through the small window hung with a curtain of strings that dangled paper strips with famous lines from shows or playwrights. Oscar Wilde. The world is a stage, but the play is badly cast. And true friends stab you in the front. Brendan Behan. I am a drinker with writing problems. Victor Hugo in Les Miserables. Life is a theater set in which there are but few practicable entrances. She looked out at the parking lot below, lit up sporadically by the neon lights on the adjacent street. He's more than reliable, she said. He's kind, clear-minded, a good dancer. He doesn't drink at all, you know, she added as she put her empty bottle on the cracked counter. And he's fun sometimes, artistic, devoted to good causes, kind. She turned around to face them. I said kind already, didn't I? Yes, you did. But you didn't say the big but, said Peary. She took out a cigarette and passed the package to Tom. But, yes, there's just something missing for me. He's so conscientious and so determined to be positive all the time. Something about that doesn't work for me. You know what I mean? I know it would drive me bonkers, said Peary, and he certainly wouldn't approve of us, would he, hun? She blew out a long stream of smoke and waved the cigarette at Tom. He pointed his cigarette back at her, and they laughed. Oh, he's not pompous or judgmental, Ilona said as she got another beer out of the fridge. Not really, although maybe just a bit. He can never understand how bummed out I am sometimes. I'm not sure what's wrong with me. I've lost some of the joy I felt when I first started working, and sometimes I feel like the world was made for men rather than women. I can't explain that. It's just a malaise with the status quo everywhere. But I admit my moods are mostly because I miss Tep. I don't go on about it, though. I just get sad. And he thinks I'm giving in to negativity too much. He wants me to be more like him, I guess, always working on my mind and my ethereal energy. My chakras aren't tuned well enough for him, she giggled. And I just want to be loved. The thought of working on my chakras tires me out. It makes me want a bad man. Some joog, said Peary. You need joog. She got an evil smirk on her face and added, It's your joog box talkin'. Tom and Ilona exchanged widening eyes and looks of mock shock. See what I mean? Said Tom. Strangers. Who knew I married a woman of such low quality, so crass? Well, she may be right. Ilona looked at them both and pursed her mouth like a church-going lady. I'm so used to spending time with Leo and never drinking at all that now just the tiniest bit of alcohol goes directly there, to that place that Piri mentioned, the joint. Then she straightened herself and looked at them as if to defy all church-going ladies everywhere. Tom and Piri looked from her to each other, miming disbelief. The next minute, Ilona had hung her head and muttered, "Shit, shit, shit, shitty shit." She put her head on the table and stayed there, tears eventually running down from her one eye and into Niagara Falls pictured on the placemat. She finally sat up. I miss Tep, and the worst part is, I don't really know what happened. He had his wife at the club, but it was totally out of the blue, and I left before we ever spoke again that night. I can't call him, and can't figure out why he doesn't call me and at least explain. I thought you loved me. You said you loved me. She sang the lyrics of the popular song, but then added, He didn't really ever say he loved me, but he acted like he did. I thought he did. She sighed again, and then got up. I've got to go home. Piri came over to her to embrace her. She said, Hey, I saw you looking at the theater quotes. Don't forget that line in the Mikado. There's a fascination frantic in a ruin that's romantic. I know it's hard to find the fascinating in this situation, honey, but you will. For now, though, you can't go home alone feeling like you do. Plus, you're a little bit tipsy. Stay here. We have an extra cot. In the morning, they were sitting around the table munching cereal when Tom cleared his throat quietly and said, Ilona, we were talking it over last night when we went to bed, and we've decided that you should move in with us. Ilona started to protest, but Piri jumped in and said, Look, you and I have been talking about taking a trip to Hungary for a long time. I think it's time we did it. The move-in will be temporary, just long enough to save a bit of money, and we can go in the spring. It's only a couple of months away. You'll have time to give notice at work, and I'll have time to get in touch with the relatives that I've never seen, maybe even find my mother. She put her hand on Ilona's arm and gave it a squeeze. It'll be so much fun, and you'll finally see all those beautiful buildings your father talked about so often. Just think of all that architecture, all that history. Come on, please. I really want you to go, and Tom's got a little tour with a show starting just about when we would leave. You can put Leo on hold. It's perfect. Your father will be ecstatic. Do it for him. And your mother. Don't you think your mother would demand that you go after all the... Okay, Piroska. That is enough. Stop now. Ilona shook her head, then made a little bow and said, It's a good idea. Thank you. Piri let out a whoop of happiness, and Tom slammed his hand on the table. Good girl, he said. Let's set up a space now.
When the moon rides the sky, when the black night is clear, silver enters my eye, magic sighs in my ear, swirling into my brain, whirling me into dance. Come, come, the refrain, come where love gives the chance. How the night winds can rush, how it captures your soul, how the stars become lush, how the music can roar. Come, oh come and be free.
1960, springtime. Strange, isn't it? The friends were walking along Andrassy Street in the heart of Budapest after climbing up from the old downtown subway. I mean, Peary continued, it's a little spooky to be in a place where we were born and have it be so foreign. Why, they don't even speak English, she joked. Ilona gave her the disapproving look passed down from her parents for inappropriate behavior, then craned her neck to view the splendid opera house they were passing. Well, it doesn't have the mad dashery of New York City, but it's incredibly beautiful. I'm a little surprised at that, in spite of all my father's ravings. I had such a dark vision of this country, with their communist past and their poverty and revolutions. I wasn't expecting happy, but I can see that there is a proud and refined sensibility here. And the apartment where Franz Liszt lived and taught music is just down a ways on the corner. Imagine how wonderful it would have been to have taken lessons from him. The language is a bit, removed from English, I'll admit. Peary looked at the map she was carrying. At least you've heard some of those weird consonant sounds before. I don't have any experience of it. Not since I was too young to remember. And I'm not sure my mouth will be able to twist itself around the words without strangling my tongue. Just remember what Goldie always says, that every new learning fold in the brain is good exercise to keep it healthy and kicking. A kicking brain I can get from a good bottle of wine. How about I just let you do the talking while I do the drinking? I think the restaurant at the corner looks good. Want to go for it? Remember when we were doing the Gurdjieff Kerchief dance? Laughed Peary. They were climbing the stairs of the building to get to List's apartment. She had to steady herself with the handrail, she was giggling so much, punching the air with her free fist at the same time. Oh God, that was so insane and so awfully, wonderfully irreverent. Yes, I remember. It had been Ilona's private rejection of Leo's devotion to his spiritual master. She still felt a little guilty sometimes, but although she admired Leo, it was a way of life she couldn't share. They got to the floor of the apartment and paid the woman at the desk, then entered, and looked around the study at the various family photographs, the single bed with the carved headboard, and the prie-dieu with the crucifix on it. They went into the second room, and both exclaimed, "Ah!" together on seeing the black Chickering grand piano that had been Liszt's, with its elaborate silver candelabra adorned with musicians' heads. Ilona and Peary spent a couple of days together, wandering the streets and marveling at its grandeur. They saw buildings that were massive and proud, with an elegance that made Ilona think of the most magnificent and beautiful periods of music and architecture. And although she had never been to Vienna, she imagined Budapest representing the same richness and royalty. There was a pride to this country of her parents, a pride well-founded, and she realized how much they had given up by leaving for the United States. As they walked along Bartok Bela Street on the third day, Peary wondered aloud, why do they name it backwards? They were approaching one of the many bridges that crossed the Danube River, the Szabadság. The famous Gellert Spa was nearby, with the Gellert Hill rising high above the city. I guess that's why the spa is right there, to mend you after you make that climb. Let's go there, she added, meaning the spa. Ilona was savoring the feel of the city, looking in the window of a small restaurant on the corner, its musicians in traditional Hungarian garb. Yeah, she answered, but I'd rather go to the Királypasz. It's smaller and less expensive, built in the second half of the 16th century by Ottoman Turks. My dad told me about it. He said the building is a little crumbly on the outside, but everything is there, and it's good. We can walk along the Danube's edge to get there. Bit far, but we're young and healthy, right? Sure, answered Peary. I'm easy. Whatever Lorna wants, she sang, revising a bit the song from Damn Yankees. Besides, I need to walk off that poppy seed pie before I buy the next one. It was yummy. It was finom. She used the Hungarian word for delicious, having learned it the day before. Is that where English got the word phenomenal? It sounds like it. Anyway, it was phenomenally yummy. They walked along the river's edge, gigantic rock of the hill rising on their left. There were boats going up and down the water, and the sun sparkled on the waves. Ilona wore her black pencil skirt with a soft blue pullover. Peary sported her A-line dress of pink linen with a matching jacket, and they both wore their black tams with what they thought was European aplomb. They also wore sensible low shoes rather than the more favored heels of New York City. Again, advice from Stefan for long sightseeing treks, and more bohemian in any case. As they got closer to the chain bridge, they both pulled out their brownie cameras to preserve the wonder of it. The bridge, supported by only 2 pillars and hanging on huge iron chains with 2 lions on the bridgeheads, was planned and designed by a British architect in 1842, and it was opened 7 years later. "It's wonderful," said Peary, "but we should come back at night to photograph it then, when it's all lit." Meanwhile, the walk had increased their appetite for coffee and snack. They found a simple shop and went in. Peary all the while reminiscing about the early-century New York cafe they had been delighted to find earlier, rubbernecking at its glamour, the marbles, mirrors, and frescoes, works of many Hungarian artists. "So, what do you think of your homeland?" Ilona asked. "Do you feel a connection at all?" Peary drove into her pie, chewing and miming a slow, happy death before answering. "Have to be honest, not really, although I like this city. It's very impressive, and obviously a very old and cultured civilization. The people are very nice. I hope my trip to the countryside where I supposedly came from is as good." "Oh, you'll meet people, and hopefully someone who knows your family or a distant relative. At least I hope so. What time does your train go tomorrow?" "About 3 in the afternoon, I think, so no rush. And we have 10 days before we meet up again, don't we?" Ilona was looking through her date book, leather-covered with an embossed raven, that she'd bought in the square outside Matthias Church. "Yes, back at the Matthias, 4 p.m. a week from Saturday. We can see a few more things then, the Museum of Fine Arts, and I'd like to visit the Acquainted, where the Romans built a town in the 1st century." "Okay, I'll make my list on the train." Peary was gathering up her things, sorting out her forint to pay the bill. "Köszönöm." "Thank you," they both chorused to the waitress as they left. They got to Batyány tér, where they could see the enormous and imposing structure of the Parliament buildings across the river on the Pest side of the city. From there, the walk to Király Bath was not too far, and once inside they both relaxed in the thermal waters a long time, even indulging in a therapeutic massage before heading back to their lodgings. The busy streets were full as they watched from the tram window, each woman with her own thoughts and planning the coming week. "Nem értem." "I don't understand," said the lady that Ilona had asked directions of, trying out the little vocabulary that she had. At home she could understand a few commands and endearments from her parents, but the main language in their home had been English, to adapt quickly to their new land. She tried again. "Hol von Srini you ut," simplifying her question and figuring if she could find that street, she would locate St. Stephen's Basilica from there, or ask someone else. She was on her way to a concert of classical music. Her father had insisted she see the stunning structure, constructed over 50 years and completed in 1905. Stefan had rhapsodized about its neo-Renaissance beauty, named for the first king of Hungary, and insisted that she had to hear music there to appreciate its acoustics. It turned out to be a short walk from Andrassy Street, hard to miss because of its monolithic size. Ilona climbed the steps and entered the carved wooden doors, finding herself in the mammoth interior, shining in gold, marble, with enormous candelabra, statues, and painted ceilings and arches. She was momentarily unable to move, trying to absorb it all, stunned at the size, which could accommodate 8,000 worshippers. When she was finally seated, after walking up and down the aisles in awe, the chamber orchestra began their program of various pieces, and she was transported by the exquisite sounds that filled the space with even the quietest notes. Saint-Saëns, Vivaldi, the ethereal Panis Angelicus by Franck, and her always beloved Adagio by Albinoni, among many other selections. She felt sanctified, her heart and mind swelling with the tones. She felt healed, returned to her original soul, holy and safe again, and alone on its own course. Aunt Sophia lived in Szentendre, a village about 20 kilometers from the center of Budapest. It was an old town on the banks of the Danube River, going back to settlements of the 11th century. As she walked slowly over the cobblestone streets that covered the hillside, Ilona felt the warmth of the beautiful sunshine that lit up the Baroque church spires and the tightly packed and colorful houses. She heard the words of her father in her mind, describing the charm of the rooftop angles and tiles that were typical of his sister's house, and saying how he missed the hilltop vistas and tiny crowded lanes. He had been very adamant that Ilona visit with Sophia, his younger sibling, especially since her husband had died just 5 years prior. Ilona found the house easily, directed there by a group of neighbors who had been watching for her approach, excitedly anticipating the arrival of the young American woman. The group grew as more and more neighbors joined in the march down the street to her aunt's home. Once there, alerted by the babbling on the street, Aunt Sophia rushed from her door to embrace and just about suffocate Ilona with the voluminous blue dress that she wore. "Ilonka!" The huge arms encircled her, and she heard a stream of Hungarian endearments and exclamations, all unintelligible to Ilona, while being covered with kisses. Ilona had seen old photographs of her aunt, but the woman who was clasping her was like a triple version of the little sister that her father had known. She was large and hearty, and, Ilona thought unkindly, rather like a tugboat. But she was drawn into the house, her aunt shooing away the others with the promise of a later visit, and Ilona saw that her aunt was a sweet and caring soul, as well as a housekeeper of meticulous organization. They sat down to tea and sweets, talked and looked at picture albums, and Aunt Sophia wept a few tears over her dear brother gone to America, as well as her dear husband gone to glory. "Oh, Georgie!" she cried, dabbing at her eyes and cheeks with her flowered handkerchief. "He was so good to me, and such a man of loving." This last added with a knowing and coquettish look at her niece. Ilona found herself blushing at this bit of intimate knowledge, but she couldn't help laughing and feeling a connection with this woman, so unlike her father. And then she sat entranced as she heard stories of her family's past, the revolutions, the hardships, alongside the joys. Aunt Sophia wept again, this time with laughter, as she recounted the story of Georgie, almost blind, emptying a serving of goulash onto the table in front of him, not realizing that Sophia had taken away his bowl to fill. "Poor darling, I did love him so." They spent the next few days easily, exploring the cultural history and treasures of the area, and they parted tearfully, with promises of letters and more photographs in the future. When Ilona and Piri met up again, they both had stories to tell. Ilona of her visit with her Aunt Sophia and all the touring she had done, Piri with the amazing news of finding a relative. They passed the remaining time in excursions. They went to Hero Square. They learned the terrible history of the shoe memorial on the Danube, remembering people who were murdered at its edge and left to fall into the river during the Second World War. They saw more buildings and they ate. During that time, Ilona felt the idea solidify in her mind, that the new sights and places she was experiencing and the wash they provided to her spirit were necessary to her. It was a new feeling for her, away from all she had known and grown with, even the good times with Tep, even her beloved architecture. She experienced a sense of herself, alone, that made her feel a little high and giddy. She felt that there were secrets she had yet to discover and understand, both in the world and in herself. She sensed that whatever happened in the future, she would be strengthened and helped through by the time she spent here. She announced to Piri that instead of returning to New York just then, she was going to travel to Paris first.
Sourire secret, espoir muet, demeure du cœur fragile. Idée qui va vers l'au-delà, espace caché tranquille.
1960, spring and summer. Ilona sat on the stone bench in front of a monument in the Père Lachaise graveyard. She knocked off first one shoe and then the other, and looked around herself at the trees, not yet in bloom. There was a clump of daffodils shining brilliantly behind her as she stretched out one leg in front of her on the cool stone and rubbed her calf. She had been walking around Paris all morning, looking at buildings, avenues, and churches, window shopping down the Champs-Élysées, marveling at the venerable architecture of theaters and museums, and even train stations like the old Gare d'Orsay. There were so many more places to visit, but she had time to see them later in her stay, and had decided that for that day she would make just one more stop at the famous cemetery, and once there, to have her own small picnic in the peaceful quiet. Across from her was the grand structure, twice as tall as her, housing the remains of the Italian composer Rossini. She had strolled down the many meandering cobbled paths and seen huge stone memorials for so many artists, writers, architects, and musicians, many of them piled high with floral bouquets and planters. Chopin was there, and Oscar Wilde, and Sarah Bernhardt. She was hungry and pleasantly tired, enjoying her stay in the beautiful city, 5 days into her visit already. She opened up her sandwich, bought earlier at a little kiosk, and bit into the fresh bread, so delicious, and so completely different from the commercial brands in New York. She smiled at the thought that she was actually in Paris, survivor of so many waves of kings and wars, fashions and fluctuations, and she made plans for her tour. The Sorbonne, she thought, and all the tiny little back streets I can find in between the famous landmarks. She had read bits of Balzac, Proust, Flaubert, Molière, Stendhal, Voltaire, Mauriac, Baudelaire. Her mother had carried her library of these authors and poets with her from Hungary, and she encouraged Ilona to study them during her high school years of French, helping her daughter to read them and supplying a gigantic French-English dictionary, along with a stern look. It was such fun to see the real streets and locales that she had read about and imagined, and Paris was so alive. The people were not overly friendly, but so engaged in their lives and life itself that she too was swept into their intensity, as well as their well-known joie de vivre. The next day she was up early, walking down the Avenue de la Fontaine de Rôle in Nanterre, and on her way once again to see as much of the city as she could. She started with the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, visited the Louvre, the Tuileries palaces and gardens, saw Rodin's Le Penseur, along with La Porte de l'Enfer, L'Ombre, and many of his other works. And she had crossed over the Seine on one of its many bridges and listened to musicians outside of Notre Dame Cathedral. Her plan was to go up to the Église Sacré-Cœur, but before making the climb up to it, she stopped at a little bistro in Montmartre for some lunch. She opened a newspaper up, wondering where the jazz clubs were, thinking perhaps she would find one of the spots that Tep had played in and spoken about. She was poring over the entertainment section when she decided to have a second cup of coffee. She didn't normally drink it, but everything in Paris seemed to smell and taste better. She was waving her hand in vain, trying to get the waiter's eye, when a man at the next table called out, "S'il vous plaît, garçon!" Bringing the server over and indicating to him the neighboring mademoiselle. Ilona ordered her coffee, then said, "Merci, monsieur," to her helper, returning to her newspaper. Then she looked up again, feeling rude, and wanting to acknowledge his aid. "Je m'excuse," she said. "Pas du tout," he answered, gallantly gesturing non with his hands. "Je vois que vous lisez le journal. C'est plus que fait la plupart des gens." He then translated, "Most tourists don't even try to read the French newspapers, so you're ahead of them all." "Well, I look at the headlines, or, like right now, look for a name I might know." "Can I help you at all? What name are you looking for?" Ilona tried to dismiss the search, shrugging and waving her hand. I don't really know. I mean, I'd know the name if I saw it, but..." And she stopped, feeling a little foolish. "I'm trying to find a jazz club. You know, la musique?" "Bien sûr. J'aime le jazz. Je l'écoute de temps en temps. I get out once in a while to a club. I can tell you about one place I know." And then he apologized profusely, saying, "Mais pardon, mademoiselle. I should introduce myself. Luc Saint-Martin." And with that he proffered his hand. "Ilona Szabo, pleased to meet you. I'm here from New York for a week or so." They sat in their places, smiling faintly, a little unsure of where to go next, until Luc lifted his coffee cup and looked at her as if to ask, "May I join you?" And Ilona invited him to her table, where they continued their lunches in companionable conversation. She told him about her trip to Hungary, and about her work in architecture. He told her he had worked for a few years in accounting, but his real interest was in computers, a relatively new field. "Although it's not new at all," he explained to her. "The first computers were built back in the late 20s and early 30s. And of course, there were the famous Bletchley Park computers, used to break the German codes during the war. Father had worked with the French resistance. I was still young, only 15 when the war ended. But when I heard that story, I was enthralled with the intrigue, and with the capability of those machines. I knew I wanted to study more. The accounting job was a way to earn some money for my further studies, but in the last few years, the science of computers has jumped by leaps and bounds, I think you say in English. Like a rabbit," he said, making bounding movements with his hands across the table. Ilona laughed, and finished the last of her coffee. "It's been great to meet you," she said, picking up her things. "Maybe we could go to that club I know of one night, if you want," Luc offered. "Sure," she said. "We could meet there Friday night if you're free." They made the arrangements, and Ilona left to tackle the mountain of Sacré-Cœur Church.
I love you, I love you, I love you every day, and my heart can't know, it can only say, I love you, I love you, I love you even more. It's a happy, happy day. I love you, I love you, I love you every day, and my heart can't know, it can only say, I love you even more. It's a happy day. Well, I love you every day. My heart can know, it can only say I love you even more. What a happy day. When I wanna see you, I look around in the sky, on the ground. I see a shiny pebble or a leaf in flight. I see my love, my life. Well, I love you, I love you, I love you every day. My heart can only say.
Spring passed quickly, and Ilona got used to working at a job that really didn't require too much thought. It was a nice change, she thought, and a relief after all the time she had spent focused only on one goal and one way of looking at everything. She was changing in a lot of ways, learning a little more French, seeing all the history and art of the city, and relaxing into an enjoyment of life that she hadn't known previously. Recently she had discovered more of the world of computers, since Luc had helped her secure a position at the small firm where he worked. They had gone to the nightclub for jazz after their first meeting. Then Luc had suggested he show her a bit more of Paris, some of the cafes and brasseries that he frequented. When her time in the city came to an end, she realized that she wanted more of Paris, and more of the freedom that she'd experienced, except for the fact that she needed more money. Hence the new job, filing computer-punched cards. Over the weeks, she saw much of the city, eating at many little corner restaurants that served food so delicious she felt almost drunk when she walked out. Then she walked and walked until her shoes and her feet were worn out. She saw all the wonders of the city, most of the time alone. She loved to wander in the evenings along the Seine, breathing in the warm summer air, listening to street music, and stopping in bookstores. She visited the Musée de Cluny and had seen the beautiful tapestries of La Dame à la Licorne, falling in love with the rich and russety red of the works and the grace and serenity of the lady and the five senses represented. Gradually she spent more time with Luc. They went one night to the famous Jazz Hot Club, where, he informed her, many members of the French resistance had been active during the war, passing information to England. They listened to the music and talked. He asked her about her family, and she told him her background. That's why I was in Hungary, seeing the old country, my parents' roots, and all the marvelous history of their culture. It was strangely comforting being there, like finding a little piece of myself. I wouldn't want to stay, but I'm glad I went. I met another Ilona, too, first time in my life. Tell me another little piece of yourself. What's your second name? Luc asked. I think that those names are an important part of an identity, too. Mine's Antoine. It was my grandfather's name. That's my connection to it. Mine is Stefana, after my father, and we're definitely connected. I don't think about the name too often, though. Well, I think since everyone else always calls you by your first name, that I will call you Stéphanie, the French version of your second name. That way, I will make a special connection to you, one separate from your other life. If you don't mind, of course. Ilona smiled, rolling the idea around in her head like she'd seen Luc roll a small bouchée of wine before he nodded to the server. The idea suited the sense of herself changing during her time in Paris, and she was inclined to play with it, thinking of Piri, and wondering if she shouldn't jump into new things and be more spontaneous like her. Goldie, too, she thought, would approve, fitting the change into her philosophy of women needing to create new and stronger identities of leadership. It was only later that night, when they had gone back to Luc's apartment loft, and she had given in to her need to make love again, that she said, "Oui, ça va. Dès maintenant, je serai Stéphanie. From now on, I'm Stephanie." She went to sleep with Luke beside her, enjoying the feel of a new beginning. Some weeks later, they were walking in the Luxembourg Gardens one night, Luke talking about the beginnings of mathematics and numbers and the development of the computer in general. "Did you know," he said, "that the earliest use of algorithms was by the Babylonians in 1800 BC? Amazing, n'est-ce pas, Stephanie?" Making a point, as he often did now, of using her new name with a meaningful look and smile, familiarizing both of them. He picked up a petal fallen from a fading white rose, rolling his fingers over the velvet surface. It was a long process, but a continual one. But the biggest advances happened only since the end of the 19th century, and then everything snowballed in the 20th. There were many others walking in the park, as always, couples and families, young and old, singles and laughing groups, and a soft breeze picked up the ends of Stephanie's hair. She reveled in the dark of the night and the lights and laughter of the city all around them, the feeling of ease and casual love that she felt was always present, no matter what the situation. She took the soft petal Luke handed to her and touched it to her cheek, watching the quarter moon slide behind and out again from the branches of the trees. So much history everywhere, so many lives lived through so many years, centuries and centuries. It certainly puts your own life into perspective a bit more when you think of all the love and sadness and creativity and knowledge that has gone before you. They were walking now in the direction of the Sorbonne, and Stephanie was reminded of the very early beginnings of that institution. "Back in the 13th century," she said, "and 100 years earlier, its parent, the University of Paris, and I saw some of the ancient ruins of the beginnings of the city, called Lutetia then, as I'm sure you know, a first-century amphitheater at the Arène de Lutèce, and later the remains of a Roman public bath at the Cluny Museum." She stopped to button up her small cardigan. "Our lives are like little tiny waves on a big ocean, it seems to me. À mon avis. In my opinion," she said, and then added, "I think I'll just enjoy the rolling tide." She was reminded of how Tepp used to speak of improvisation in jazz, just rolling along on the vibe. No thinking, only the awareness of the moment. And she realized that she hadn't thought about him that night up until that point.
One day I woke up and I thought, I've just gotta see you again, 'cause you are magic to me. You are the one I must see. All the things I remember, ways I adore, moments so tender, they make me want more. Today is a day, I promise, I will see you again, 'cause you are essential to me.
1960, fall. In late fall, Stephanie went with Luke to dinner at his sister Madeleine's apartment, where they gorged themselves on the classic cordon bleu chicken, vegetables, salad, and a very satisfying Beaujolais. They ate in the tiny kitchen, in a nook that reminded Stephanie of an intimate corner in a fine dining room, especially as it was painted a soft teal, and its 3 walls were hung with prints of Toulouse-Lautrec's La Goulue at the Moulin Rouge, Van Gogh's church at Auvers-sur-Oise, and a still life of apples and oranges by Cézanne. Madeleine was older than Luke, and happy to take care of her little brother once in a while. She and Stephanie had spent friendly evenings together on occasion. On this night, Luke had taken himself to a spot in the living room, going back and forth between his papers and looking up information in books piled at his feet. The women sat in the kitchen and opened another bottle with their cake. Chatted about life, the new President de Gaulle, places to visit, and finally Madeleine's work as librarian. The first time they had met, Madeleine was surprised that Stephanie had never seen the library where she worked. It was the historic Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, and Madeleine insisted that they meet one night after work and she would show Stephanie the famous building. Stephanie arrived at number 10 on the Place du Panthéon and looked up at the huge rectangular structure. She loved the arched windows on the second level. But other than that, the library did not look to her to be as magnificent as she had imagined. She did see the names of over 800 scholars inscribed on the façade, and that piqued her curiosity. Entering, she soon found Madeleine, and they began their tour, starting with Madeleine's short lecture on its earliest beginnings as an abbey, one of the oldest, which by the 12th century had received donations of years of many texts and monastic living, hence the scholars' commemoration. It was not until the 19th century, however, that plans were made to construct the current library. Henri Labrouste, the architect, designed the building. Construction began in 1843 and took almost 7 years to complete. Stephanie listened to the story as she gazed at the stack of books, the offices, and the stairway up to the second level. Climbing to the top, Stephanie was astounded by the light and grandeur of the reading room, which filled the whole space. It was a miracle of glass and iron, the iron visible in graceful arches, making a space of magnificent elegance and sophistication. It was quiet and peaceful. She imagined herself studying there, inspired by the intelligence and vision that had created it. She thought about her love of architecture and realized that soon, not right then, but soon, she would go back to it. In the kitchen, Stephanie thought about a book she had recently read and asked Madeleine about it, adding that she had identified so strongly with the author's confession of always running away from himself. I thought, that's me. And then I figured that probably a lot of people thought the same thing, and I felt a bit stupid, that the revelation was not quite so world-shattering or unique after all.
Mais non, c'est pas stupide, c'est pour ça.
That's why the book succeeds. It resonates with each of us, brings out feelings that we may have been hiding from ourselves. It's unique for each person. The friends were clearing away some of the dishes when Madeleine asked about how Stephanie was enjoying her stay in Paris. Oh, I love it. It's a great change for me, and there are so many beautiful places to see and study. The Palais Garnier, the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, that ceiling in the Tower of Jean Sans Peur. It's so beautiful. Oh, and the one in the Hôtel de Cluny as well. I could look at buildings all day long if I didn't have to work. I guess that job is pretty dull for you, said Madeleine. A big come-down after architecture. But then it's probably temporary. Do you have any plans for staying or traveling more? I know Luc would like it if you were here. Stephanie sipped on her wine and played with a snow globe on the table, turning it upside down and watching the little scene of a mountain home in winter. She looked at Madeleine and began to speak. The job is fine, not demanding. It allows me to absorb all of what I have seen here and in Hungary. But you see, well, I'm not sure what my plans are right now. She stopped and stole a glance at Luc, deep in his work. It's okay, said Madeleine. You don't have to explain. To me, least of all. And Luc, he knows. And he understands, too. He told me that you are not in love with him. He's aware of a lot of things, even if sometimes he seems like the absent-minded professor. Of course he would like it if you were in love, but he's very open-minded and caring, and he's happy with you. I can see that. He'll be happy for as long as you are here. Really? He told you that? Stephanie was taken aback, but relieved at the same time. She knew that although she cared for Luc a great deal, she didn't love him, not in a way that would be permanent, and she had worried about the imbalance in their emotions. Luc's philosophical approach to love was part of his scientific mindset, she guessed. And Madeline agreed with that when Stephanie said as much to her. And she added, Luke has always been in his own world, figuring out formulae, building things, and talking. Boy, he could talk a lot about science. She told Stephanie about one time when they were walking together, Luke speaking so excitedly about some mathematical problem he had worked out, and how it was going to fit into some project. I had no idea what he was saying, but I just loved the way he understood all of it and was so enthused. He's a dear person to me, and very smart. You know, out of many schools, he scored the highest in math. Madeline put a slice of cake on a plate and carried it in to her brother.
That was something. After so long, you still here. And I went through the years that had passed, and I went through our different worlds, and I went through the separate lives we've led. Back to you, and the memory took me back to you. Walking around through our favorite old haunts.
1960, December. One December night, Paris was looking like the little snow globe at Madeleine's when Luke and Stephanie decided to have another jazz outing. They had finished a good dinner and just picked up and went along to a little boîte they had discovered earlier, where Nina Simone had played, as well as other visiting American musicians. They got to the front doors and the billboards outside, and Stephanie took a step back in shock. Luke looked at her, then at the poster, and he took her arm. "We don't have to go in," he said. "I'm sorry, I didn't know he was playing here. Do you want to leave?" He looked so contrite and uncomfortable that Stephanie almost forgot her own distress. She sighed. "No, let's go in." She wasn't at all sure that she wanted to do that, but she felt as though she had to. She pulled the door handle and resolved to face the music, literally. It had only been just over a year since that awful night in New York, the night she was on her own. But it seemed so far away, so much had happened, and so many changes in her life had occurred. Her heart had not changed, however, and she felt her emotions rising, knowing that she would see Tep. "I'll have a bloody Caesar," she said when Luke and the waiter had looked at her expectantly. She thought of Caesar being stabbed by his friend. Then she shook her head at her flight into melodrama, trying to clear her mind and not be overwhelmed by her feelings. She remembered all the tracts she had read at Leo's behest, chapters written by Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, teachers of the way, a spiritual practice to control emotions, to bring mind and body together to a higher consciousness. It was a worthy goal, to awaken ourselves and reach our full potential. But Stephanie did not like the strictures that reminded her of her past religious training. What was wrong with simply trying to be good and trusting in yourself, she wondered, without all the guru worship and fun-destroying directives, without the guilt for not continually transcending this life. Sometimes she thought of the leader as Mr. Kerchief, and she and Goldie and Peary would tie their kerchiefs tightly over their heads so they had bulging peasant cheeks, and walk around the room, beating their bad emotions in the air, laughing like idiots. When Tep walked onto the bandstand, she was shocked to see how he had changed too. But his changes were physical. He'd lost weight, and a bit of the casual spring that he'd had in his step. His opening notes proved, though, that his playing was as swift and confident, and to her, glorious as ever. She was transported immediately to all the nights she had listened to him at various clubs in New York. She felt her brain opening up, and knew again the joy and desire to let her mind travel to new places, creating. She realized she had been muffling herself over the past year, and she breathed deeply to finally let some of her unhappiness go, if only for the length of the song. She looked over at Luke, who had been stealing glances at her, and she smiled and put her hand on his. He toasted her with his bottle of beer. They listened to the set and relaxed a bit. The break was almost over when Luke went to the men's room, and Stephanie decided she had to speak to Tep. She got up from her table just as he was moving from one group of fans to another. He looked in her direction, and she saw his surprise at seeing her. His face broke into the grin that had been so familiar to her, and she felt herself go a little dizzy as they approached each other. They had only hugged and said, "How are you?" to each other when his bandmates started to gather on stage. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and then, "I wrote you," and was about to explain more when Luke came back, passing them. Stephanie introduced him to Tep, but Luke discreetly excused himself directly and returned to their table. Tep asked for her address before he returned to the stage. They stayed for only half of the next set, then decided to leave. Before they went, she wrote her address on a piece of paper and dropped it on the piano top. Luke and she walked through the snow-dusted street and down into the subway. They chatted, while the blurring tunnels flew behind windows like the images from Stephanie's past flew through her head. He told her that he had enjoyed the music a lot, and they continued in companionable conversation, but when they got to her flat, he took her shoulders in his hands and said, "Alors, c'est le moment. Il faut que tu ailles, mon amour, ma belle et grande amie." She knew he was right. It was time, and soon she would go.